Well, it may seem a bit pretentious that I take my relatively monopolistic position to grasp this free slot which became available because Oscar unfortunately fell ill. But as I said before, I have also had the impression that rather many had looked forward to this relatively special input, and at short notice then I thought a simple and not too complicated solution would be that I would like to present some of the ideas of Oscar Necht and a few others within his theory or tradition of critical theory, and comment them in a way as to say why I think they are important for this research community. And yeah, that's it. It's not a result of a lot of preparatory work, as you can imagine. On the other side, it's I have worked with Oscar Necht's works and with him personally for many years, so it's also based on a lot of impressions about his thinking, and so I just put a few keywords on a display to help follow the impression. I have here the original title of his talk, Political Education in Global Capitalism, the Continental European Experience. And this title, as long as it is, expresses somehow the intention that we think that I used to say that the Atlantic Ocean is very deep, but sometimes I also realize that even the channel is quite a water. So there is a division of the intellectual traditions which is quite strong between continental Europe and the Anglophone world, going out from good old Britain, and as I guess most of us realize, this community is really the last remnants of the British Empire, the people who belong to the English-speaking countries and who went out from, or whose ancestors went out from Britain. So in this sense, there is a language question. Us coming from the small countries, we cannot do so very much, but there's one thing we can. This is learn foreign language. We need to do that, and this means that some of us have access to German and French, very few to Spanish or Iberian traditions, just to mention 3 large European traditions which have been living relatively separate, and this has of course to do with imperialism, because it was the 4 empires in Europe, and they had their own world, and they are big enough to cater for themselves. They don't have to translate other people's thoughts. They have their own thoughts, and then comes this very big swing in the recent, well, after Second World War, maybe you could say, but especially in the last 2-3 decades, that a global capitalism going out from the Anglophone world, mainly from North America, becomes absolutely hegemonic in terms of language and in terms of networks. And it's even so when we in Denmark count the product of our academic work, then we do it by counting contributions in journals which are, with very few exceptions, published in UK or United States. So this is really a strong hegemony. And I'm not, so to say, trying to turn that over or to oppose that. On the contrary, I'm a warm speaker for a lingua franca English as working language in the international community, although we must remember that we are not all native speakers. But there is a real danger that those intellectual traditions in the German and the French and Iberian will get lost or become a ghetto for those poor 100 million people who speak German or well, I made a lecture or an arrangement in Portugal, and I was taught by the Ministry of Education in Portugal, who was going to open a conference, that although he spoke very well English, he was a scientist, he would not speak in anything but Portuguese. And if I was not aware, this was, I think, the third biggest language in the world, measured by people, or fourth, I think, measured by the number of people having it as their native language. We could easily forget those simple facts. We started maybe to remind ourselves about China, and now I want to remind us about the Abendländer, the declining empires which have a decreasing significance outside their own region, and some of their intellectual treasuries, or whatever you call it. And I think Oscar Negre is one of them, and the tradition in which he has been writing and thinking is very valuable, very interesting, has played a big role for our research and also political discussion in Denmark, well, in Danish left wing, I have to say, because it's not necessarily mainstream. And Oscar would have held a lecture which was about what the political education tradition has in continental Europe, which is different. And I think he was especially preoccupied with the question about how this challenge of Europe, of the Europeanization and the identity aspects of it, how they could be seen not just as obstacle to building a strong, uniform, bigger society, but also as resources which could be used for another way of understanding cultural and social and political processes. His paper, which is close to the talk he would have been held, will be published, so you will have that as a kind of bonus. Oscar Negre is, first of all, a political philosopher and a political practitioner. He is a sociologist. He has been teaching until a few years ago sociology and political science at the University of Hanover, formerly Technische Universität Hannover. But he has all the time also been a political activist in a way, very active participant in public discussion in Germany, very strongly involved in political discussion in the trade unions in Germany, closely related to the SPD, the Social Democrat Party, in spite of the fact that he, in the eyes of the party, betrayed this party together with some other young socialists some 40 years ago. And he was a close advisor of the former Bundeskanzler Schröder. So he has been in this critical, friendly dialogue with the established political social democratic party and movement in Germany. But talking about work and learning, one of his first important contributions was a little book, which is that little, called Soziologische Fantasie und exemplarisches Lernen, Sociological Imagination and Exemplary Learning, in my slightly helpless translation. The point in this book, he was at that time employed in the trade union education center in Olesen near Frankfurt. And the point of this was, so to say, a critique of the didactic of labor education, in which you assume that if you tell the workers what they should do and why they should do it, then they will do it. So it was a critique both on social democrat mass education of party activists and trade union activists, and also of different versions of communist parties, elitist ideas about that if you know how it really is, then you just need to tell people, then they will do it. The theoretical underpinning was rather simple. It took some of the ideas about sociological imagination, which, what is the American author? Yes, Wright Mills, and said, well, what it is about is that you must be able to see your own everyday life in a sociological or societal perspective, and see societal issues as they appear in your everyday life. That's all. But the learning point was, may seem simple by now, but it was really a strong attack on the practice of worker education, that learning is based on the experiences of workers in everyday life, including the workplace. And any educational effort which does not take its point of departure in that, but in a theory or some political dogma or some pre-manufactured strategy, will fail. Referring back to the big labor revolt in Germany in the late 60s with big wild strikes all over, but also referring back to the Weimar Republic time between the two wars, where both the Social Democrats and the Communists failed very badly in maintaining the engagement of workers, and where the Nazi party showed how it must be done, namely by organizing emotions and immediate experiences and anxieties of people from their everyday life, and give it a direction. So that was also the point, the framework. He has been continuously dealing with the role of trade unions with the belief that trade unions are very decisive, democratic organizations, and have this status of being civil society organizations which are based in the one relation which constitutes a capitalist society, namely work. And he has continuously been commenting and discussing with the trade unions also when he, so to say, went academic. The first book I mentioned, Die Herausforderung der Gewerkschaften, I think there may be small errors in the years, because I thought it was more important to have the right decade than not to have anything. It's around 86. Challenging trade unions for an extended political and cultural mandate of trade unions, something like that. That is to say, the argument was that if the trade unions limit themselves to the narrow fight for wage, labor, interest, wages, and so on, then they will not be able to fulfill their mandate as democratic organizations. So he argues that they need to be cultural organizations, they need to be political organizations, they need to deal with the entire life of people. And following up in the later book from 2004, Wozu noch Gewerkschaften, means something like, little nice red book, are trade unions still needed? What are they still needed for? That is more or less the translation. And as an illustration of his political way of engaging, I would like also to mention a book called Lebendige Arbeit Enteigneter Zeit from the same period. It means the living work and the stolen time. And I'll come back to that, but it was written with the point of departure in a very big industrial dispute in Germany over work hours. The big discussion about the shortening of the work week to 35 hours, which led to a big strike. And you could say that in one way this is just a conflict of the traditional kind about how much work for how much money. But what he tried to do in this book was then to say that this cannot be limited to a fight about the number of work hours. First, it is a fight about the right to employment and the right to be a working person. But it also deals with the question about which work hours. How are these work hours? So you could say it was a big discussion all over Europe at the time whether we were now moving quickly towards a society of freedom where we would have robots doing the work and we would look in 2 hours a week and check that they were working. And the rest of the time we would try to make sense of our lives. And into, of course, caricature. But he pointed out the danger of focusing the liberation entirely on the question about limiting the work hours, and instead pointed to the need to also fight for better work, better quality of work. And there comes, so to say, one of the key notions which has echoed in his writing later, and which I think is a very productive work, namely the living work, lebendige Arbeit. Because, I mean, the stolen time, this is good old anti-capitalist propaganda talk, but this notion about the living work, where you say that work is not something you let steal or sell away, it is life. It takes us on to very important themes that also resonance with the trade union discussion, namely to say that we must in the labor movement not only deal with the trading of labor, but we must also deal with questions like what are we producing? It also attached to the discussion about what in Germany was called Rüstungskonversion, as could you not convert some of the arms industry into something more useful? Trade unions started to have that as an agenda. Do we just leave it to the capitalists or the employers to decide what the production should be? And you see, some of you probably also know the big discussion around the closing down of Lucas Aerospace, where some people managed to design an idea about an alternative use of all these resources and skills which were in the Lucas Aerospace, which was mainly an arms industry, and could be used for more reasonable production. So this is a trade union theme to say we need to deal with, say, in simple Marxistic terms, not only the exchange value, but also the use value of the production. And it also announces some other themes that have become very important in the meantime. Environment issues we need in the trade unions and the labor movement to deal with environment issues, the externalities of the production, even though they have nothing to do with our factory and our workplace. We need to think about how the ecological base of the production and the environment aspects of production influence life. And gender relations, because, and this is a very important theme coming up here, which I will, well, maybe continue to say this is the next big conceptual framework, which in our context I would put in the following way: do we know what work is? You could say that we have adopted the multiplicity of different types of work, different work domains, and so on. But still, I think we have in our minds and souls and bodies a referential idea about wage labor, paid work in manufacturing, production, and all the rest being deviants, being variations which are deviant from this real work. What Oscar and others did in this context was to say that capitalism has defined a lot of work as not work. And the most important is the female domains, the reproduction work, the caring, the education and upbringing of children, the social relations that must be handled in family and communities. So this has been defined as not work, in spite of the fact that obviously it is absolutely necessary for a society to function and for people to grow up and to thrive and to be able to work. So I would say that this question which is put is what is work is in a way a critical perspective on the way in which capitalist modernization and the gender system related to it has established a hegemonial understanding of what work is. And so this takes me to the main, in my opinion, the main important contribution of this thinking, which is also the bigger books here on the table. This one called Geschichte und Eigensinn. I think it was 81, first published. It's not easy to translate. Geschichte is easy, that's history. But Eigensinn is a little more complicated because it means on the one side autonomy, the fact that somebody have their own integrity and autonomy, and on the other side that something is meaningful in itself. It's a play with words in German. It has its own meaning, that is ihren eigenen Sinn, but also that people have their own autonomy. And of course it refers to both the work and the workers. The work having its meaning in itself, and the workers having an autonomy by being workers, which puts some limitation to the societal subordination. And so you could say this book is written together with Alexander Kluge, filmmaker, and it is actually like a kind of film picking together a lot of small pieces and observations and reflections and so on. But the long red line in this book, which I think is a wonderful book, it's also funny to read in the same way as Marx and other people, those who here and there suddenly a very essential concept is defined, and then comes something about how they did with cloth sometimes in England, and then he continues. So this type of writing, which you may dislike very much or you may find entertaining. But I'm sure that very few of you, if any, have read it. And it's not only for language reasons, because people who know German also very often do not read it. But the red line, yeah, it's a pity, but I mean, well, I put them there because I read it, but I could have just done it, okay? But the red line in this is to try to follow the development of work and workability, first as evolution and then as history. That is to say that the work competence is not just something that you learn in apprenticeships or in a school, and it's not just the competences that we know now as work competences, which is somehow, we also reflect that, related to mode of production and technology and so on. But it's actually an attempt to indicate the full story of development of societies and forms of work, down to the question about why we have this wonderful thing, the thumb, which enables fantastic new competences in terms of manual work, which those who don't have it, the monkeys, cannot conduct. So, I mean, this is on the funny side, but the whole more essential, something like the fine motoric skills, which is bodily development, which comes with evolution, and which is essential for a lot of work. And of course we can make speculations about what will happen with the human body as those manual skills and motoric skills play a significantly lower role in our everyday lives, and what happens with the mental apparatus as a consequence of that. It's that line of thinking, but for a political perspective, of course, the most important is to say that work is a historical phenomenon, work competence is a historical phenomenon, and workers develop their own self-esteem and their own autonomy on the basis of being workers, and that is to say the work competence is the most fundamental foundation of democratic and self-regulating abilities. He has later collected with other writings on work, made this what is it, Mental Shelf book, which contains it all. It's called well, was it not there? Oh. There's something went wrong with my morning work. Well, it's called Arbeit und menschliche Würde, that is to say, work and human dignity. And so you see, so to say, a new twist of the autonomy and of the Eigensinn idea, that it has to do with the say fundamental human dignity, and one of the important conceptual aspect of this, following up on this lebendige Arbeit, is to to apply an ecological perspective on work, to see work and workability by involving this bodily and mental aspect of workability. It is based on the human being as a natural being, at the same time as reflecting on the environmental or the relations to the nature out there. He launches a notion which I think is quite useful also for political and social analysis, namely what he calls the economy of the entire house in English, or household economy. The point is to say that this word eco, which is in economy, and ecology, which is coming from a Greek word which is called something like oikos. Oikos is the name for a traditional pre-modern household. That is to say, a household in which you have the whole responsibility for all the members, and you live in a more or less closed environment, and you have not entered into the exchange economy, which we know from modernized economies. And so his point is, so to say, the same as I tried to indicate before, that economy is the most economic conceptions of societal exchange are false or limited in the sense that they cut off some dimensions of the economic activity which would be incorporated if you talk about the household. Namely, that it makes a difference whatever products and whatever use values, whatever qualities you consume, and it makes a difference what you do with the non-consumables. So a household, an economic conception which is based in the household notion, would be something like an ecological way of seeing economy. Now, in the meantime, ecology has mostly been used in a more narrow sense as something which has to do with nature. And that's one of the reasons I want to emphasize that he actually uses this unity of the natural and use value aspects of the societal exchange in the notion. Well, he's also made interesting things apart from that, which I will only mention. A book called Kindheit und Schule in einer Welt der Umbrüche, Childhood and Schools in a Time of Transformations or Ruptures, don't know how strong to translate it, is an attempt to, he also made a small school together with some other parents, and this is partly a reflection of this question: how does childhood look in our time, and how can you make a framework of a children's growing up and learning which makes sense in a society like ours? And he wrote a book about China, which is a fantastic book. It's called Modernisierung im Zeichen des Drachens. That's something like modernization in the image of the dragon, or under the dragon symbol. That is the Chinese traditional symbol. And it consists of, it's formerly a travel diary, and it consists of two pieces, 2 lines of text. One is a report from a long study tour in China at a time where at least most of us did not visit China, which goes very deep and, as far as I can judge, insightful into history and thinking and arts of Chinese development, but especially also focuses on the attempts, because there's more than one, to modernize China. And then a parallel text which deals with European modernization from Renaissance up to that time, which was 80-something. At least it was substantially earlier than Tiananmen. And what, apart from interesting reflections on what modernization is, what are the decisive moments of modernization, mirrored in the question, why do they fail in China in their modernizations? Then it is also raising the interesting question, is there just one modernization possible? Is there only the Occidental way to modernization, which we usually praise and identify with, starting with the Renaissance, Enlightenment, development, technology, instrumental reason, separation of mind and body, and so on. You name all the essentials of the Occidental pathway of modernization, which is contradicted in different ways by Chinese tradition, as Jian Huang said the other day, our Confucian wisdom, which is of another kind than enlightenment, and which in some ways counter argues basic values and basic modalities of the Western modernization. And so he tries to raise this discussion, which I think is more interesting than ever, not only for us, but also for the Chinese. I mean, China is a society which has been relatively more closed than at least any other big country from Western influence until the day where Deng said that he didn't care about the color of the cat if only it could catch mice, and the opening of China in order to accelerate economic development started. From this time you have the interesting experiment going on. What happens if you put Chinese people and Western capitalism in a glass and mix it well? Just a few final notes about how I think this has been or is important for our research area. Starting with Marxism, I think it's dangerous, sticky terrain, but I dare to do it still. You could say that very often when I talk with progressive people from United States, let us take United States, there are few here, so then I have the feeling that they are fighting a Marxism that I don't know, or at least I have only read about it. It's not the type of Marxism we have met in Europe. We have met some which are similar, which are authoritarian and elitist, and have had a tendency to separate economy and culture and politics. But the Marxism that I tend to refer to, I could call the left Marxist tradition, which was submerged in the real developing communism in Eastern Europe and Soviet Russia. But for example, a writer like Georges Lucas, who was up to a certain point part of the communist movement, he was a minister in Hungary sometimes after the First World War. But he wrote the famous book, which is called Geschichte und Klassenbewusstsein, History and Class Consciousness, which is a book about how the cultural or the experiential aspect of the labor movement of the classes is the most interesting, and is a historical phenomenon which is based on, as Marx says, on the production relations, or on the material relations, but still is culture and consciousness. And going on to the Frankfurt School, which was rather isolated in a way. It was very important in the time, but the people in the Frankfurt School, it worked only a short time, and then they had to run away from the Nazis, and some of them survived in U.S. and some of them returned from U.S. and re-establishing the Frankfurt School, the Institute of Social Research in Frankfurt after the Second World War. So it was always a relatively submerged or marginal phenomenon, but after all, enormously influential in European left-wing and social science thinking. Adorno, Horkheimer, Habermas, Honneth, mentioned by, so to say, descendant generation, belong to this stream. And then on the other side, you could say what I call the culturalist tradition, which identify with names like Gramsci and Raymond Williams, who are thinkers and writers who focus on the culture aspect and the cultural dominance as maybe the most important aspect of class society, and therefore basis of political relations as well. This is some of the types of Marxism, or the versions of Marxism that have been more dominant in the German-speaking world or in continental Europe. And then, he was the conclusions. It is important. Adorno was a philosopher. He was in a way a very traditional philosopher, and he started to deal with phenomenology with a point of departure that you need to relate to the material world, and so found out that there was a fundamental mistake or shortcoming in phenomenology, namely to isolate the objects or the things, the material world, to split it in pieces. And from this goes a direct way to Marxism, namely to say that you need to think about the material world, but you need to see it as in a holistic way, as something which is entirely interdependent. You cannot. I heard a joke from, I'm sure some of my Danish colleagues knows it, a joke from an examination in those days where there was a political polarization, where some social science teacher at an examination would take up his box of matches. It was a time where he was still smoking. And he would take his box of matches and say how much the surplus value is in this box of matches in order to drive this Marxist student mad. The basic thing is that Adorno actually starts out with phenomenology, that is with the material world, and tries to find out how it can be conceptualized in a historical and holistic way. And then a big theme which is absolutely essential for myself and also for some of my colleagues, namely the question about the historical subject, the fact that the subject is an embodiment of societal relations. which takes us into the social psychology aspects of critical theory, which are not so strongly articulated in Nicht's writings, but they are, so to say, supposed. But some others have done it more clearly. Regine Becker-Schmidt, who is more or less same age, same generation as Nicht, has coined the notion of Geschlechterverhältnis, which I translate as gender system. That is to say, a thinking which comes back to this economy of the whole house or the household economy in the way, namely to say that the organization of societal work and the societal organization of gender relations are intertwined and cannot be separated from each other. There is a direct relation between the complementary gender relation and the way of societal work organization. And the other one I would mention is, so to say, a little younger, which is not that he is very young, Thomas Leithäuser, who is also coming from phenomenology and social psychology, but adopting the critical theory in understanding of societal frameworks, who has coined, for example, this notion of Alltagsbewusstsein. You will recognize that this is everyday life consciousness, refers back to what Nicht said already early in the worker education context, that later that consciousness is based on experiences of everyday life. Leithäuser's addition to this is then to emphasize the psychodynamic aspect of the consciousness of everyday life, namely that we, in our interactive social situations, produce consciousness which makes life bearable. That is to say, we produce routine consciousness, we produce harmonic or relatively conflict-free and partly and compartmentalized, divided consciousness, which makes it possible to live in a society which basically exposes us to contradictions, which would be very painful if you had to think about it all the time, but which become acceptable when you have pieces of routinized consciousness which, so to say, organizes a part of your life. This notion and this way of thinking is, in my opinion, very productive in understanding a lot of workplace learning and workplace practices and conditions of people's work identity. Well, that's, very briefly, and I mean, some of you will have recognized everything, and others may think it is vague and difficult to understand. I hope that you would become a little bit curious. Unfortunately, Oscar Nicht is not translated into English, apart from one or two articles. And although he belongs to the same tradition as, for example, Jürgen Habermas, who is translated extensively, then they are also very different. Oscar Nicht is much more political. He's much more sensitive to work and work relations, and that is to say, in our context, he is much closer than, say, the general ideas about social relations and communication, which many of you pick up from Habermas. So although there is a kind of shared ancestors, there is also a lot of difference in the way they approach things. So, yeah, I really think it's a pity that the old man couldn't make it, and I know he's sad about it himself. Yeah, thank you. You're welcome to have a look